Picture a witch. You probably imagine an old woman in a pointed hat, stirring something questionable in a cauldron and flying on a broomstick. This caricature has become so familiar that we don't even think about its origin. But what if I told you that the real witch hunts were caused not by satanic rituals, but by one of the most successful and deadly PR campaigns in history? What if the real horror lay not in magic, but in the printed word? In the late 15th century, Europe was a nervous place. Crop failures, diseases, wars, all of it demanded a simple explanation. The idea that the blame lay not with economics, but with the schemes of the devil and his earthly minions was tempting. It gave people a sense of control. It seemed that if they could find and destroy the witches, the world would become safe again. It was a grand concept of sanitizing society, and its creators fervently believed they were waging a war for the souls of mankind. However, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The consequence was that the system began to devour itself. Accusations of witchcraft became the perfect tool for settling domestic disputes. A neighbor won't repay a debt. He's a warlock. You fancy someone's plot of land. Its owner is a witch. In essence, the witch hunt turned into a legalized method of settling personal scores. The ironic result of this project was its legal absurdity. Not only people were put on trial, but also animals. The pinnacle was the myth of the witch's mark, any birthmark that was considered proof. The logic was killer. If you have a mole, you're a witch. If you don't, you've hidden it very well. A no-win situation. Every paranoia must have its author. In our story, it's the Inquisitor Heinrich Kraumer. This gentleman was obsessed with the idea of not just proving the existence of witches, but creating a universal guide for their discovery and destruction. His environment, late medieval Europe, steeped in superstition and fear, became the perfect incubator for his cruel ideas. Kramer's key mistake was his vindictiveness. During one of the trials, a local bishop found the Inquisitor's arguments unconvincing and essentially threw him out. Imagine the scene, a fanatic vested with power being publicly humiliated. The enraged Kramer sat down and wrote a book. This book became his personal revenge on the world that dared to doubt him. It was the most dangerous kind of creation, one born of resentment. His creation, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, became the quintessence of hatred. In it, he detailed how to recognize a witch, how to conduct interrogations, and what tortures to apply. It was not a theological essay, but a field manual for the hunter. In essence, a humiliated man created a weapon of mass destruction that allowed thousands like him to act out their darkest fantasies under the cover of law. But how did this book become so popular? If Kramer's book was a virus, it needed a carrier to spread. That detail that changed everything was the printing press. Before its invention, books were handwritten and expensive. Ideas, even crazy ones, spread slowly. A mad inquisitor's tract would likely have gathered dust in a couple of libraries. The press became for this mental contagion what the internet has become for modern fake news. But the printing press changed everything. It launched what we would call viral content distribution. The Hammer of Witches became a 15th century bestseller. It could be printed quickly and cheaply. The book, rejected by theologians, suddenly appeared on the desk of every judge, priest, and literate townsman from England to Poland. Paranoia became accessible to the masses. For the common person, this meant catastrophe. Imagine a local healer who was previously respected. Now a neighbor has a book that says, "Women who heal with herbs are candidates for being witches." The technology of text replication turned an author's paranoia into a pan-European epidemic of fear, reinforced by the authority of the printed word. And this book gave clear instructions. So how did this conveyor belt of death work? Let's imagine the mechanism of a witch trial as simply as possible. It all started with a denunciation. No evidence was needed. It was enough to say, "I don't like her." Then came the arrest. The main problem for the judges was the lack of proof, as no one had seen broomstick flights. But this problem was elegantly solved with torture. It was believed that the devil gave a witch the strength to endure pain, so the longer she didn't confess, the stronger her guilt. The main stages: denunciation, torture, confession. After a few days of interrogation, 99% of the accused confessed to everything. After confessing, they were required to name accomplices. Thus, one trial triggered a chain of new ones. It's like a pyramid scheme where each new member must bring in several more for the system to survive. Only here, human lives were used instead of money. The most gruesome part of the mechanism was the trial by water. The accused was bound and thrown into a river. If she floated, her guilt was proven and she was burned. If she drowned, she was innocent, posthumously exonerated. It was a perfect system from the prosecution's point of view, a classic catch-22, where any outcome confirmed you were right. But what was it like to be inside this machine? Now let's put ourselves in the victim's place. Imagine Anna, a widow of about 50. Before these events, she was an ordinary member of the community. She lived alone, knew about herbs, and could help with sick livestock. Perhaps she was a bit of a loner, but she was respected for her knowledge. Her life was simple: a garden, chickens, trips to church. She was a familiar part of the social landscape. Then, a neighbor with whom Anna had quarreled over a boundary has a cow die. Previously, this would have been blamed on illness, but now the neighbor has a trendy book. He files a denunciation. Anna faces a dilemma with no good solution. If she denies the accusations, she will be tortured until she dies or confesses. If she immediately incriminates herself to end the torment, she will be executed anyway. It was a choice between a horrible death and a very horrible death. Trying to survive, many tried to be as inconspicuous as possible. But it didn't help. The afterlife for Anna's family was destroyed. The stigma of being a witch's family meant social isolation and poverty. Her property was likely confiscated. The system didn't just kill people, it erased them from the community's life. And who benefited from this? The main victims of the witch hunts were, of course, women, especially those who stood out: widows, the childless, the independent. But in a broader sense, the victim was all of society. Basic trust was destroyed. Any neighbor could be an informer. An era that could have been the start of scientific progress became mired in mass psychosis for centuries, burning its primitive healthcare system at the stake. The dark side of the process was its economic underpinning. In many regions, the property of an executed witch was divided among the church, the authorities, and the denouncer. This created a monstrous incentive. The witch hunt was not just a fight for faith, but also a profitable business. The resources wasted were colossal: thousands of lives and the social capital of trust that could have been spent on real development. There are few amusing anecdotes here, but there are instructive ones. In some German towns, the hunt reached such a scale that there were simply no women left to accuse. Then, they began to accuse men and children. The economies of these towns collapsed. The machine devoured itself to the core. It's an example of how a system built on greed and stupidity ultimately destroys not only its victims, but also its creators. So what is the main myth about witches? The myth is that there was an organized satanic cult that brave inquisitors fought against. In reality, there was no army of witches. There was an epidemic of fear, multiplied by ignorance and amplified by the new technology of printing. A witch was not a reality, but a social role, a label attached to the undesirable to explain the unexplainable and solve one's own problems at someone else's expense. Now imagine yourself as a resident of such a village. If your neighbor were accused of witchcraft, what would you do? Would you try to stand up for them, risking being burned at the stake alongside them? Or would you watch in silence to protect your family? It's a difficult question, and an honest answer can tell us a lot about ourselves. Write your opinion in the comments, and if you liked this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. The witch hunts eventually subsided, but the mechanism of finding enemies never went away. In the 20th century, it was revived with new force, only instead of magic, enemies were accused of ideology. In our next episode, we'll tell you how the fear of the Red Scare gave rise to a new witch hunt in the United States.